Okay, so execution and learning. How do you actually learn while you go? Because nothing ever works out quite the way you want. So for today, you read chapter 6 in Strategy and Action. That's all about execution. And some of those tools should have looked familiar, like the after action review, and some might be new. What I thought we would start with is logic models, which you read about, which are related to theories of action. So I wanted to put a frame before we talk very specifically about logic models on just kind of the notion of logic models and theories of action, because they're very much the same thing. They're just at different grain sizes. So here's how I think about both of them. Both of them are very helpful for execution, and they're also helpful for learning from execution. So a lot of the tools that we're going to be practicing with are things you could use before you start actually executing, like you've made the plan and now you're really trying to figure out what are we going to do. They're also things that you can come back to while you're executing, or if you didn't do them at the beginning, which, if I'm being honest, I don't always do all this stuff before I get going, they're also useful to do midstream because they help make explicit how we think what we're doing is going to lead to something else. So they're very similar ideas, logic models and theories of action, because they're both essentially causal models. So they're basically both saying, if we do this set of things, we expect them to lead to this set of outcomes. And I think of it basically as theories of action being at a higher level, kind of one grain size up from logic models. So if you think, like, roughly speaking, you have your strategy. Here's what we're going to want to do really broadly. Then we have our theory of action. If we do X, then we expect it to lead to these sorts of things. And then logic models sit under theories of action as one level more specific about how we expect those things to lead to those kinds of outcomes. So another way they're similar is that the process of doing them is just as valuable as the product. So the point isn't necessarily just to come up with the logic model or the theory of action. It's that the discussion you have while you're producing it is part of what leads to success. Because what happens is you start calibrating on people's expectations of, like, what are we actually going to do to make that thing happen, and what outcomes do we expect, and how are we going to get there? The best example I have from my own experience in that is I was working with a district that had decided to implement math coaching in the district. And they had very successfully used literacy coaches. And they were looking at their math scores, and they're trying to implement a new math curriculum, and their math scores weren't where they wanted. And they said, you know what? Literacy coaches have been so helpful to us. We should have math coaches. And that is going to help us with math. So they started having math coaches. And they didn't do a logic model or theory of action. They were just kind of like, we've got some problems in math. Literacy coaching has worked. Let's do math coaching. So basically, their theory of action was, if we do math coaching, then math scores will go up. That was kind of their theory of action. So about midstream, about this point in the year, they asked me to come work with the coaches and the principals and some central office folks. So I said, why don't we do a logic model about coaching? What do you expect it to lead to? And about 45 minutes in, one of the coaches looked at one of the principals and one of the central office people said, that's how you expect coaching to lead to those outcomes? I should be spending my time entirely differently than what I'm spending my time doing. Like, I had a totally different idea about how this coaching was going to lead to improved outcomes. And so it was in the conversations they were having with each other that they surfaced, like, we just have totally different ideas about how this math coaching that we all agreed was a good idea was going to work. And so that's an example of how it's the process of having the conversation that often is leading to the shared understanding. That's what really makes the difference. And then the product is helpful because it's something you can come back to and you can share with other people who weren't in the conversation. So both things are valuable. What's a logic model? It's basically a roadmap that tells you how you're getting from here to there. The first bucket of things are activities and resources. What exactly are we doing? And what resources do we have to draw on? Resources can be people, time, money. Like, we have these meetings, set aside. We have these people already in place. We have these dollars accessible to us. So So you're saying, what do we already have to work with? What are the things we expect to do? Those are usually relatively easy for people to describe. The harder part is that stuff in blue, which is what do we expect to happen as a result of doing those things? Now, I often suggest that people start with the outcomes, begin with the end in mind and try to work backwards. Sometimes people can get stuck there because it's actually sometimes really hard to articulate the outcomes. So the beauty about constructing a logic model is you can start from any which way in the model and fill things in. But ultimately, you want all of the things filled in, and then you want to look across and see, does it actually make logical sense? That's hence the name logic model. You're looking to see, is it logical that if we move from left to right, one thing will actually lead to another? I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about outputs and outcomes, because those can be a little confusing what the difference is, but it can be a useful distinction. Some logic models expressly put measures as a separate thing, and others just fold it into outcomes. You'll see it in a couple of different ways. I think it's useful to name them separately, because in education sometimes we have so much trouble figuring out how are we going to measure things other than a periodic test score. So it's a kind of discipline that lets us push ourselves to know how would we measure it. Similarly, that piece in orange there, assumptions, is something that not all logic models make explicit. You'll see it in the strategy and action example that we do have assumptions. I think it's helpful to have the assumptions because it's a little bit of, again, trying to make explicit what is this dependent on? Is there some contingency this is dependent on? Let me just make explicit my theory about why this should lead to that. And that's usually where people disagree some. Like, oh, you think that's how that's going to work? I'm not exactly sure that that's true. So all of this is your best guess. Now, if you do it midstream, it's also you're articulating, here's still our best guess, but it's kind of documenting work in progress as well. So you're trying to make explicit all of the implicit things. And logic models and theories of action are similar in that you're supposed to be able to predict the likelihood of getting those outcomes when you look across. Like, does that look like it's actually going to work? Or can we anticipate where the gaps are? Like, you know what? We don't actually have the capacity to pull off that. We don't have the resources. So we either need to get more resources, or we need to change our expectations of outcomes, or we need to change what we can do on the activities, et cetera. So here's a couple quotes I thought were useful about just framing why use a logic model. This is from a book called Making Strategy Work. And Lawrence, I don't even know how to say the last name, but I'm going to go for it, with Hrebiniak. Managers need a logical model to guide execution actions. Without guidelines, execution becomes a helter-skelter affair. Does anybody ever feel like you're in a helter-skelter affair with execution? So without guidelines, so this is without that logic, it can just become basically everybody kind of doing their own thing. He says, without guidance, individuals do the things they think are important, often resulting in uncoordinated, divergent, even conflicting decisions and actions. So this is, well-intentioned people doing what they think is going to lead to the outcome, but each person is doing their own thing, and that creates the helter-skelter. So without the benefit of a logical approach, execution suffers or fails because managers don't know what steps to take and when to take them. Having a model or roadmap positively affects execution success. And then he connects this with strategy, which it doesn't, he says basically it all begins with strategy. Execution cannot occur until one has something to execute. Bad strategy begets poor execution and poor outcomes. So it's important to focus first on a sound strategy. What that's basically saying is, you can logic model away, but if you're not clear on what the thing is that you're placing your bet on, that you really think is going to lead to the outcomes, it doesn't matter how explicit you get about it. You have to be just really clear about what the bet is in the first place. So make sure when you are going to invest the time in doing a logic model, you felt like math coaching. We really think math coaching is going to be helpful, and so it's worth spending the investment in making this logic model. So we basically said these already. Why use a logic model? You're trying to make explicit what's in various individuals' heads. You're trying to create a roadmap so that people can come back to it. Like, hey, we said we were going to do this, not that. It's also to assess before you start and midstream how things are going. And if you do it before you start, it can be useful, like, do we just proceed with some adjustments? If you do it midstream, it can help you check, like, are we calibrated? Like I said in that math coaching example of how we expect this to lead. It really is helpful for getting everybody on the same page. And all of that makes you more likely to succeed. So as we wrote about in chapter 6, logic models can feel kind of cumbersome to people who aren't used to them. People who are used to living in the foundation world are quite used to logic models, because a lot of foundations require logic models before they'll give you money. That's kind of the way they'll say, like, oh, that looks like you're going to use our resources wisely if you can produce a logic model. But for most of us, it's not very common. So the question is, like, why bother? But it usually saves you a bunch of time and energy in the long run and makes you more likely to succeed. So just circling back to outputs and outcomes for a second. This can be a little bit confusing. And like all tools, you don't want to get too caught up in the semantics. Like, you basically want it to be useful for you. But I think the distinction can be quite useful between these two things. So outputs are basically what's produced by doing the activities. So they're often things you can see, touch, very tangible products of things, a document, a policy. The outcomes are trying to measure the impact. So an example from your colleagues on Wednesday was one of your colleagues was writing about having a new graduation policy written across 2 high schools. And at first he had it in the outcomes column. And I said, no, that's not actually an outcome. Like, the policy isn't the outcome. The policy is the output. You have this new graduation policy. I said, what outcome do you expect to come of that? Like, why are you doing it in the first place? What do you hope will happen? He said, oh, well, we want shared understanding across the high schools of, common high expectations for our graduates. I said, great, that's your outcome, common high expectations for our graduates. And then the question will be, how do you measure that? How would you know whether you got that outcome? So that's the distinction. And another person, one of your colleagues on Wednesday, said, I think about it basically as outputs are the tangibles and outcomes are the intangibles, the things you can't put your hands on, but are the things you're hoping will happen. Logic models work better when the people making them have some agency about making the things happen, as opposed to, well, we're going to make a logic model, especially for a mandate or something that's coming from outside, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about outcomes that I feel accountable for, but I don't feel like I have a lot of agency around the activities and the resources. That is going to work less well, because all the calibration around, like, oh, you think that? Like, we're creating our road. Like, if you don't feel like you have some of the agency over the road, then you just feel accountable for the outcomes. So I can see how that would be less good. So as you think about how to use this tool, you can think about what's something that we're betting on, we're investing heavily in, we think it's going to make a big difference for learning, and it's worth calibrating and getting everybody on the same road to get there. So that's logic models. Now, theories of action are quite similar, and this is going to be a very quick run through, but because some people are familiar with one and not the other, I just wanted to connect them. As I said before, they're very similar in that they're both about, like, if we do these things, then these will happen as a result. Theories of action are essentially statements or a series of statements, whereas a logic model tends to be more visual. It has the parts broken out. A theory of action is essentially if-then statement. If we do X, then we expect Y to happen. Both of them should be falsifiable, but theories of action are often one level of abstraction up. But you should think about, could we measure whether this is actually true or not? Like, this is our best hypothesis about how to get this outcome. We'll be able to come back and see whether the hypothesis is true or not. It is, like a logic model, identifying where to put your energy and effort. So if you're in the system, like, here's our theory of action, like, this is what we're betting on, then everybody knows, like, that's where we're putting our energy and effort. It, of course, should focus on the instructional core. So learners, facilitators of learning, content, that should be showing up in there somewhere, because that's why we all are doing our work. It's also generally connecting your improvement strategy to problems of practice. So you should, in the theory of action, be able to see, like, where are the bets in this organization, and how does that connect to something that they care about. And the last piece that I think is most important about theory of action is it gives you the storyline. Like, it's basically the story of what are we doing and why in a fairly condensed way. So not everybody's walking around with the logic model in their head, But you should have, in the theory of action, you should have a story that people can hold on to about what we're doing and why. And all the whys are quite similar to a logic model about making the implicit explicit, connecting action to result, building that common language. I also think theories of action in particular are helpful for cutting through the clutter, like all the noise that you have in your systems that are trying to distract you from things. The theory of action can kind of be that anchoring through line. One thing I've noticed about theories of action is they can be easier to build sometimes. You start with the if, you add the main things, we're going to change adult behavior, you add the then, and you finish with the results you want. It sounds pretty simple. What often happens in theories of action is that there are these big gaps between parts of the theory of action. So I call those the then a miracle happens boxes. If we do this, then a miracle happens, and this results. And oftentimes, the trick is to figure out how much of the black box to fill in. You don't want like a 2-page theory of action. But you want enough that it's clear how you get there. So this is a little visual representation of that, which is, okay, if we do this, there's the black box, then a miracle happens, then this will happen. So if we do X, student achievement goes up. Like that's often what theories of action sound like at first. And then when people try to unpack the black box, often what's missing is something about adult capacity building. So often theories of action at first are written like, if we do X, if people would just do X, like, come on, people, then student achievement would go up. But often what's missing at first in theories of action is how do you build adult knowledge, skill, will around whatever X is? Because often, like, if people knew how to do it, they would be doing it. And so often when you unpack the black box, it's making more explicit, oh, if we do this to support the adult learnings, then adults will know how to do this and they'll see the value. And if they experience success, then adult behavior will change. And then student behavior will change. So I always pause and ask, do the essential people already know how to do it? Or do we need to do something to support them? So that's theories of action and logic models. Sometimes people can get kind of stuck like, do I have the right grain size? Am I being too specific, too general? My rule of thumb there is always just do what's useful for you. Like the whole point is to make that implicit explicit and make it useful for you as a storyline. So I'm not going to go through all these because we already talked about them. The thing to remember about both of these is that they're iterative. They're never perfect. And the whole point about using them for execution is that as you start executing, you learn what were we right about in our best guesses about how things would unfold. What are we learning like, ooh, we thought people knew how to do that, but we actually need to invest more. Or we thought it was going to work this way with these students, but it turns out not to work so well for some of the students, so we need to make this adjustment. So they're always iterative and you're always learning. And the point about doing them collectively is that if you could do the work by yourself, you would have already done it, right? And so part of what these tools are doing is helping get collectives on the same page, because you can't actually do the work all by yourself. One of the things you read about in chapter 6 was work plans. So I wanted to just say a couple things about work plans, and then I'll review a couple tools for you. One of the reasons we spent time in the execution chapter talking about work plans is that in education, we tend not to be very disciplined about work plans. Like broadly speaking, maybe some of you are awesome at it. I personally am not that awesome at it. Like I like to live up in the big clouds a little bit. And if you've ever done that compass points protocol that we talk about in meeting-wise where you surface preferences, you've got the big picture thinkers, you've got the people who like to plunge into action, you've got the detail-oriented people. So work plans are things that the detail-oriented people love because they're one level down from your logic model and they get to a level of detail that's about who exactly is doing what, when, and how are we going to know it's done. And if you don't have that, you can sort of get away with having the logic model, but it gets really, really hard to see if you're on track for where you're headed. So the level of detail needed to actually really execute something on the ground is at that level. So I'm not going to say a whole lot more about work plans, except that I put this question up there about, is fidelity of implementation always your goal? Because often when we talk about execution, we're saying like, we're gonna do all this planning, and then the goal is fidelity of implementation. And I personally think, yes, we should try to do the things we said we wanted to do, because that was our best thinking about how it would work. But when things go a little awry, either because like maybe we had a snow day and we couldn't actually do the all-day in-service we had planned, or maybe like something else came up and it kind of changed our plan. We didn't have the resources, or somebody was sick that day, or whatever. Those often create new opportunities for learning that get pretty interesting. So where you start getting a little bit of variation usually creates some interesting moments for learning. So I always think, of course, we want to try to do what we said we were going to do. And that's one of the reasons that both in work plans and in logic models, when you have the outputs, those are the things that say, did we do what we said we were going to do? But if we didn't, how do we use that for learning? So I'm not as hardcore about like, everybody has to be faithful to the implementation, but I'm more interested in, did we do what we said we were going to do? If not, why not? And in either case, what did we learn from it? Thank you.